Wow. Much easier than books. Like miles and miles. They're ups and downs. Yeah. Good job. You're doing amazing.
It's like it's really a team effort.
You know, it's increasing.
It is.
Yeah.
Oh wow! Thank you. You don't have to.
I totally just look at
It's all corrupt. It's good. It's crazy.
Sorry, no, Polina got up there and we like weren't nervous.
Wow.
Every event.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah. Like,
Yeah.
well, we were like, no, she's gonna do a good job because we're great.
Well, thank you. I also had a lot of practice at this point. Doing a lot of that. To the point that I'm like sort of like on the other side.
Exactly.
But yeah, I don't know. It's oh, good. Well, yeah. Well, you know, it's like, as you know, it's like when you have your book published, set 3-month thing aside to sell it. So,
I know. Yeah, that alone has
yeah,
been like.
I know that's.
I can't even. I have no idea how you.
It's like you and Ruth, same time. I think hers also came out on like month 2 or something like that. And it's her first. It's
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah, I think having some perspective, knowing what it, having it done it once made it easier. Also, I was yeah. I thought Anton was easier tonight. Sure.
what?
He's just like.
That's never the case. Once you think the first one is easy, the other one, the second one should be difficult. Or the other way around. The first one's like so terrible. You barely make it to second, and then you do, and then it's
Yeah.
magical, easy baby. You don't get to have like 2 easy kids.
I would not say Anton was easy. That's all I knew.
That's all you know.
Yeah. He was not an easy baby, but
Because now you know.
now I know what
You're
easy
like
baby
bar
is.
up.
Yes, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like it's funny that you say that because I feel like because I've had a baby, I've only had so much bandwidth to do promoting for the book, and so I feel like I wish I was
your bandwidth.
Right, yeah.
Like normal, like not
Yeah.
like a month
well, I'm like
before.
looking at like whatever Julia
Oh, yeah.
EOP,
Sure.
and she's doing like all these like really like engaging reels and talks and like getting really
Yeah, but
good-
she's like she's been a journalist for decades.
Yes, I
Like a lot of them on TV. She has a
Yes.
huge following.
I know. I didn't know. Well,
Yeah,
I
she's
didn't
not just
know.
like
I
sprang out of
know,
nowhere.
I know. But I was like, I wish I could be like more active on social media.
I don't know, you pop up for me like all the freaking time.
Yeah.
Usually always more people.
Yeah.
And it's the time you just like have to accept like this is what I can do.
Yeah, it's true.
I love when I was driving to like do whatever and
Yeah.
NPR.
Oh.
And they just started talking about my friends. And I was like,
Yeah.
So it makes me so happy for you.
Yeah, that was really tough. That was definitely.
totally.
Yeah, it's still. Well, it's funny because it's like, I guess it's just like on a local station.
Right, I know. I texted you and you were like, you thought it was
Yeah.
just local.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool.
I'm gonna put my stuff somewhere.
I think so too. Yeah.
Scar.
Yeah. Yeah. But I wouldn't like. I wouldn't have it any other way. Like I just feel like you work so hard.
This was your book.
Yeah.
Like you had to do this way.
Yeah. Most of the first
It's so funny that you I took the train. This next book. Like,
Yeah.
where are we doing that?
Yeah. If you all will have.
10-book deal. I know, I'm signing you. And I don't say anything about it.
Yeah.
I think so.
Whatever. Yeah. Also. She studied, but she was and she's so close with therapists. Yeah, because of all the so I think she worked with her beyond yeah. And I did
Okay, I mean, people will be late if they're just
okay. Yeah. This is great. Yeah, you tell me whenever. Yeah, no, it's really okay, sorry, like I've just been, oh yeah.
You want a glass of water or anything?
Glass of water would be great.
It's good, yeah. Hitting that being a signature.
Yeah. And at least it's such the journals. There's something small into it down.
Yeah, no, I told you this is like 3 hours.
Yeah, had some. Yeah, she did some situations. There are a lot of like,
Okay.
Sit or stand?
Yes, I mean, it's okay to sit down.
Okay.
Right, good evening. Welcome to Globus Books. I'm very happy to see each one of you here tonight. Whenever you belong to a Russian-speaking community and piroshkis and borscht is a part of your everyday life, or you came here to learn about this fascinating cross-cultural contamination that happened to our dishes and those of us who was born, raised, and eventually immigrated from the Soviet Union or Soviet bloc countries. Right before we begin, there are a couple of announcements, and mostly for those of you who join us for the first time. The way we handle the events here, it's more like a family gathering where I lead the conversation with the author, but don't worry, we'll have a Q&A where everyone will be able to ask their own question. So maybe start think of it already if you'd like. And if you have a comment or a question, please raise your hand so we can invite you to speak. What else? We are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel. You know what to do. Email it to a friend, leave a comment. I will kindly suggest to subscribe, not only because we have unique content. This year is a big year for us. We celebrate 55 years in business at this very location. And later in the year, we're planning to have a huge celebration. And we want you to be a part of the celebration. So subscribe to our social media. Don't miss the invitation. Don't miss the announcement. At the end of the night, we will have what we call informal tea drinking, aka mingling, where you'll be able to taste this unique variety of foods that we prepared for you today, and also sign your copy with Polina or chat with the author nonchalantly. Well, with that, to summarize all that, let's make sure that all of our phones were silenced. Thank you. Awesome, thanks. Well, with no further ado, please let me introduce to you our guest, Polina Chesnakova. Not only she is a gorgeous woman, she's a mom of two, and she's on the tour with a baby and a mom. So huge shout out to mothers and mothers of the mothers who help with the babies. Polina is also an incredible cook and an author of a number of cookbooks, including a new book baby called Chesnok, which we're going to be present today to you and with you. So Polina, thank you so much for meeting our very diverse, multicultural community. And I think it will be okay to begin with the most obvious question. Does your last name has to do anything with the title of the book?
Yeah. Surprise, surprise. I'm sure many people here who are Russian speaking don't need an introduction, but for those who are not familiar, Chesnok is the root of my last name. It means garlic. And it also happens to be a cornerstone ingredient of Georgian cuisine. And my family, both my parents, they're not Georgian, but they were raised in Tbilisi. And so for me, Chesnok is a way to pay tributes to my roots in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus in Georgia. So it was sort of a no-brainer to have Chesnok be the title of the book. And it also, you know, the symbol of the garlic head with all the different cloves sort of symbolize all the different cultures and cuisines that I've had to juggle as a child of immigrants. Yeah,
thank you. I really like this metaphor of a glove of the garlic as a family and like each family member's ingredient that make the whole thing.
Yes, yeah.
I found it pretty cool.
Thank you.
The other Chesnok related question is from one of our clients. As I mentioned prior, through all the years we established a wide network of collectors, and one collector does that, collects cookbooks. And all of a sudden there's a question that came from Hawaii, and the question was, have you ever visit their garlic festival in Gilbert, California?
No, no, I haven't. Tell me more. Do you know anything
I
about
didn't know
it?
more. Apparently, there is
Yeah.
a garlic festival.
Oh, no, I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Chesnok is there's an actual varietal, garlic varietal called red Chesnok. And sometimes I would, go to the farmer's market and I they have elephant garlic, this garlic, and they have Chesnok garlic, and I'd always, take a picture. And I was doing some research, and I found out that this specific varietal of garlic called Chesnok actually originated in the mountains of Georgia. And when they found it, but because the Georgian name is so hard to pronounce, they gave it a Russian name that was a little bit easier, Chesnok. And so when I read that, I was sort of like, oh my gosh, it could not be a more perfect name for the book, because it really is garlic from Georgia with the Russian name. So yeah, so I haven't been to the garlic festival, but that's my fun fact about Chesnok. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I noticed that, and it's not noticed, the book itself is not the standard variety of the Eastern European recipes, but it's also the recipes from the Caucasus and the Central Asia, and it's related to the family history.
Yeah.
And what I love about this book, that is more about the family history than anything else. Could you please share with us?
Yeah. Right. So I felt, for me, when I was writing this book, there was no way to share the recipes without telling my family's story, because it really gives kind of context of why these recipes belong to each other or together in a collection. And so my mother is Russian, my father's Armenian, and my mother's family, they're originally from the region of Penza. And my great-grandfather, Matthew, he was a wealthy peasant, 1920s, they would call him a kulak. And, he was just doing well for himself. He had a lot of land. He had people working for him. And when the Bolsheviks came to power, they didn't like these people who were doing well and successful, because they had power, and they didn't want anyone who wasn't them to have power. And so they were collectivizing these lands, these farmlands, and they were planning to take everything away from my great-grandfather and ship him and his family off to Siberia. And his neighbor somehow overheard their plans for my family, and the neighbor tipped my great-grandfather off and told them, okay, tomorrow they're going to come for you and your family. And so he took everything that he owned and his 7 kids and put it all in a wagon, and they left. And they were on the road for a couple of months. They spent some time in even like Turkmenistan, and someone, I think at some point, told him, you should check out Georgia or Tbilisi, because, the climate's a little bit more mild. It's a very, open people there. You can find work there. It's very much a city of immigrants. And, during, throughout the Soviet Union's existence, there was so much migration happening, whether it was voluntary, involuntary, forced or not. And so that is how my mother's side of the family ended up in Tbilisi. And my grandfather, Ivan, was 7 years old at the time. And my mom was born in Tbilisi along with 10 of her siblings. So she was 1 out of 11. And it's so interesting to hear, her stories of growing up, because, they were very kind of low, not even low income, very kind of poor large family in Soviet Tbilisi. You know, all of her she'll tell you that her whole childhood was spent waiting in lines, which, you know, I think anyone in the Soviet Union, like, that was most of their experience. But as a child, you know, 3 or 4, she's like, I'd go with my older siblings and we'd stand in line for like a loaf of bread or tomatoes or and so that was my mom's side of the family. My father's side, he was Armenian, and a couple generations back, they left. They were sort of part of this wave of Armenians that moved to Baku. And so, starting with my great grandparents, they were all born and raised in Baku, and his father was in the military and was stationed in Tbilisi. And so that's how both my parents grew up in Tbilisi. And, you know, my mom and my aunts are all fantastic cooks, and, you know, they grew up cooking, you know, all these kind of very traditional Slavic, Eastern European dishes, and sort of these, like, you know, Soviet dishes of kotlety and olivia salad. And but, you know, having lived in Georgia for so many years, they also started to cook these foods with sort of like a Georgian accent. Lots of fresh herbs, lots of garlic, adjika, like in our kotlety or like in our soups, or you know, and they were also in community with Georgians, with Armenians, Kurds, and so they started bringing in these dishes from all these different ethnicities. And they moved to, my parents met in 89, 90. They moved to the States in 92 to Rhode Island. And five sisters ended up immigrating to Rhode Island. And they quickly found themselves in a community of immigrants from all over the former USSR. And I think that's, you know, for many of us, that is our, you know, that's sort of our experience of being able to have these communities of, you know, we don't necessarily all come from the same country, but we have this shared language bringing us together, shared history, culture. You know, Soviet Union existed for 70 years. And so, of course, it created its own culture and its own, you know, way of cooking. And so we have all of these sort of, you know, cultural touch points. And in the book, I obviously dive into all the culinary touch points that we share. And so for us, you know, we had this community, and I grew up going to a Slavic evangelical church that, you know, again, immigrants from all over the former USSR, but the services were all done in Russian. We all communicate in Russian. All of our potlucks after services were all sort of this blend of foods from all over the former USSR. And that is the community I grew up in. And I think that really helped me grow up with a strong sense of my heritage and where I came from. And like I said, I grew up, my mom and aunts, we'd probably go out to eat maybe once or twice a year. It was like a big occasion to go out. Everything was all home cooking and home food. And I was a very picky eater and did not want to eat any of my mom's food. I just like, give me hot dogs and Capri Suns. Like, that's all or like, you know, chips or whatever. And when I started getting into food on my own in high school, I really didn't want anything to do with my family's food, because for me it was boring. You know what I mean? This is the same foods that we eat every single week. Like, can't we just, now I have a collection of 200 cookbooks, and I'm cooking all sorts of different cuisines all the time. And, but, growing up, it was just the same food all the time. And I really wanted to get away and try different cuisines, cooking with different ingredients, pantries. And it wasn't until I left for college, like many immigrant children, all of a sudden you're on your own, you're responsible for cooking for yourself, that I started missing my mom's cooking. And let me know when to stop.
No, I think we've all been there. You can relate.
That's right. And so you call and it's like, okay, Mama, how do I make borscht? How do I make this? How do you make your kotlety? And they belong, that generation, they don't have cookbooks, they don't have recipes written down. Everything's like all na glass, everything is a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and trying to get recipes. It's like every time I asked for a recipe, it always changed. It was never the same. It was always like, how do you make this cake? And okay, 5 eggs. And I'm like, okay, last time you said 4 eggs. It's like, oh, I did? Okay, all right, 4 eggs. Or, like 2 cups of flour. And she's like, the orange mug with the red flowers, like two orange mugs of flour. And I was like, okay, that means nothing to me. I don't have that orange mug in my kitchen. And so that's sort of how I started to collect a lot of these recipes, was, calling up my phone, and, it was always kind of ended up in a yelling match, and I'd get off the phone sweating, and I'd have this recipe that was like half in Russian, half in English. Like the measurements were like, 4 eggs, 2 orange mugs of flour. And so I sort of had to, work off these recipes. And at some time, and I write about this experience in the book, essays called Na Glass. At some point, I also had to start cooking na glass, because I'd have the recipe, but it wasn't, all these detailed instructions. And so I started I started adding the flour, and I was like, remembered like, oh, like I remember exactly how thick that the tiesta, the batter, was supposed to be. And I remember my mom saying like it's supposed to be as thick as like our sour cream or smetana. And I was like, okay, I remember her mixing this. And so that I was like, oh, I'm starting to cook na glass too. And this was already like 2015, 2016. And around this time I realized, I started college as pre-med. And then I failed my first organic chemistry test. And then I was like, that's it. This is not for me. And I was also like finding myself hosting dinner parties and cooking more than I was like studying for these science courses. And so I started, working in kitchens outside of the classroom during summer breaks. I worked for local food publications. And then I started this blog in 2015, 2016, and I called it Chesnok. And it was a way for me to share these, recipes and this food heritage with people, mostly Americans, with other people who weren't familiar with it. Because at that time, especially during that time, people weren't really familiar with Georgia. Now people know khachapuri and hinkali, and Georgian wine. They've become really popular, the orange amber wine. But back then, I tell people my family's from Georgia, and they would just give me this blank stare of like, oh, like the state, like big deal. And I'm like, no, Georgia, the country. And they're like, where is that? Or, what kind of culture is like, is that another just, is that a Russian country or another Slavic country? And so I'd always have to, educate people. And so food is one of the best ways to share culture with other people. And so I started this blog, and I slowly started writing more about this part of the world. I started teaching classes, and I always knew, for me, everyone I think thinks that their family makes the best food. But for me, I always thought that, my mom and aunts were especially talented cooks. And because they were Russians that grew up in Georgia, they had this, they cooked a lot of Georgian cuisine, which is delicious if anyone's familiar with it. But then they also cooked all these Eastern European dishes that had this Georgian accent. So it was sort of like the best of both worlds, like, for instance, our borscht, we cook with lots of, not bell pepper, but Anaheim pepper, which is a little smoky and spicy and sweet. And we'll also add red pepper flakes and lots of cilantro at the end, and sometimes a little raw garlic, which is not traditional. Usually it's just dill and a little parsley. Or, our cotillette, they would always add lots of herbs and some adjika. Our chicken, also we love, we marinate in adjika, or our goulash or golupsi. Again, lots of fresh herbs, lots of tomatoes, peppers, carrots. And so it just kind of brought another dimension to these Slavic foods that sometimes are a little bit more reserved in ingredients and spices.
Plain.
Yes, yeah.
That's the correct word.
And so I always like from even then, you know, this was a decade ago, I already had this idea of like, okay, I really want to write a cookbook of family recipes because they're really special. And I wrote before I wrote this, I wrote 2 other cookbooks, and they were more single subject. The first was like on hot cheese. The second was called Everyday Cake. They were very straightforward, but even then, if you look at them, I'm like starting to try to share family recipes. Like the first book has a khachapuri and a recipe for mięso po-francuski, which for those who aren't familiar, it's like basically, and you can make it, I write the recipe with chicken, but you can make it with beef or pork, and it's like a layer of meat, a layer of like, we do onions and peppers, and then a layer of cheese and mayo. And then you bake it, and it's like comfort food, and it's very simple and kind of retro, but it's so delicious. And you know,
French people know nothing about this.
yeah. French people don't, or if they do, it was a very different dish in its original form. And then for my cake book, I had like my family Charlotte recipe and Napoleon. And my aunt made this pirog called Tjorte pirog. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but so you can, if you looked at my other books, you can kind of see I'm trying to do what I did with this book. And when I finally started writing this book in, I was about to say 1920, 2022, it was a couple of months after Russia invaded Ukraine. And, you know, I realized like, one, you know, this was an opportunity to document and preserve my family's recipes, because I knew that if I didn't do it, then these recipes would be lost with my mother's generation. And there weren't really that many cookbooks up until then that focused on this part of the world and that sort of canonized these recipes. On the other hand, I sort of realized that it was a way for me, an opportunity to write about the specific immigrant experience and really educate people. Because again, I think, you know, there were cookbooks before, but they were they always written through sort of this Russian lens, or they would be called like a Russian cookbook, but it was, you know, recipes with, you know, Georgian recipes and Uzbek plov, and it didn't really explain why these, you know, a Russian cookbook had these dishes from all these different countries. And so I really wanted to speak to that experience and sort of what my immigrant upbringing was like. And so that was sort of, for me, what really kind of was sort of like the secondary purpose of the book. And it was also sort of like, you know, I think in our community, we always used Russian as this like umbrella term for sort of all of us, whether we were Russian or not, and kind of speaking to that part of the world and this immigrant experience. And I think after the war, you know, people were kind of getting, especially in this community, it was sort of this identity crisis. And all of a sudden it wasn't okay to just call everything Russian, even though growing up, it's like, you know, we'd go to the Russian store, I went to the Russian church, or we'd go to the Russian neighborhood of Brighton Beach. And so that was one of the challenges of writing the book, was like, okay, how do I write about this collection of recipes and describe it to people without using that label? Because, you know, you start to look at it and realize there's so many different layers here. And it was actually thanks to Sasha and Olga here, they we're part of this Facebook group called Post-Soviet Writers of North America, and they introduced me to this term because I wasn't familiar to it. And for me, it's a very useful term because it's very accurate. It's very much, this immigrant community, diaspora, this collection of recipes wouldn't have existed together if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. And so post-Soviet for me is a very sort of accurate descriptor and transparent. And I've since read essays that, say post-Soviet is a problematic term because, you're describing, if you're describing countries like Ukraine or Georgia that are trying to get away from their Soviet past, you're sort of doing them a dishonor, right? Because they're sort of, Ukraine, they're like fighting for their lives, for their freedom, and so to continue to label them as or define them with their Soviet past, it's problematic. And again, it was helpful to have this Facebook group because I shared, the group is called Post-Soviet Writers, and I share with them this essay. It's like, okay, what do you all think? I'm trying to use this for my book, and everyone has really thoughtful answers, and I can't quite remember who wrote it, but someone said that context really matters. And for instance, I would never call just like Ukraine or Georgia out of nowhere as a post-Soviet country because they're not. They're their own country. But for this specific example or this specific context where, again, this convergence of cultures and cuisines that wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. It's a very accurate term. Or if you ever go into the Eastern European store, it's pantry, it's ingredients and pantry items from all over the former USSR. And for those who aren't familiar, they probably don't understand why all these, why the Georgian puri is next to the Borodinsky bread, and there's at the hot bar there's like kotlety and Uzbek plov and galupsi. And for us we take it for granted, but for me I had to sort of really dive into that and speak to that in the book for those who aren't familiar, to really kind of give them the full context and understanding of where we're coming from. And it was interesting when we were they call it shopping the book around. You write a proposal and then your agent or you shop it around to different publishers. And there were a handful of publishers that turned down the book because they were like, this book is too broad. Like there's too many, like what does Uzbek plov have to do with Ukrainian borscht? Like there's no unifying theme here. It's like you need to ground, like it makes sense if you wrote a cookbook on Ukrainian food or Georgian food, but this is like such a broad range. And I'm like, and this is exactly why this book needs to be published, because you don't like, for any of us in this community, we understand why these recipes belong in a book. But for anyone outside it, they don't understand. And this was a reason this book needed to be published, is to speak to that. And so their loss. And my publisher, who I worked with, she studied Eastern Europe and university, and she worked with an author, Dara Goldstein, for those who has been a food historian and scholar on Georgian and Russian cuisine for many decades now. And so they worked on a book together. So when I pitched her this book, she understood what I was trying to do with this book. So
for me, it was one of the main reasons why I thought it's going to be a great idea to have it here, because exactly for this crisis of the identity after the war started. And the beauty of it, that we can share the shuba salad or galupsi pelmeni, but at the same time, we come from different countries. We carry different identities. And thank you for normalizing that. And thank you for this amazing book. I love it. I love it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Needless to say that Na Glass is my favorite chapter because I've never seen it before anywhere else.
Yeah.
And thanks to Polina, she's very careful with describing how things were done at her home, what the orange cup means, and where you can find it.
Yeah.
And it's very lovely. Thank you
you.
for bringing the whole scope of your family traditions. And speaking of the traditions, I remember like in my family, we had those long winter nights when the whole family would sit down together at the table, making pelmeni from scratch, or sauerkraut, where you go to market, buy the cabbage. It has to be white cabbage.
White
And
cabbage,
then, yes, you go home and you cut it and cut it and cut it, and everybody has the terrible cuts on their fingers until you're done with a huge amount of it. What was your family tradition, or what is the brightest memory, like from the childhood? Maybe?
That's so funny that you bring up the kapusta, the cabbage for the white cabbage, because we were in a grocery store in Portland on Tuesday, and we were walking, past the produce, and there was a cabbage cut in half, and it was a white cabbage. And my mom, she's like, "Oh, that would be so perfect for kwashna kapusta." She's like, "Oh, I wish I could like bring it home with me," because always like around like November, she would start like rifling through the cabbage section and trying to see is it green cabbage or white cabbage, and like she probably looked like a crazy lady to anyone who didn't know what she was doing. And and just the other day it was like this beautiful white cabbage. Like, oh, I wish we could take that. There's so many. When I was working on the book, it brought up so much nostalgia for me, because as I was cooking these dishes, it just brought back so many family memories. Like, for us, hinkali, the Georgian soup dumplings, and we'd all get together for one afternoon, and it was sort of like a production line of like someone was rolling out, someone was cutting, someone was filling and forming. There were also a lot of stories that came out when I was, my mom and my aunts, we would have sort of, when we were working on the book, we'd have work days where I was like, if I was visiting, home, because I wrote the book in Seattle and my family's in Rhode Island. And when I'd visit, I'd be like, okay, tomorrow we're going to cook X, Y, and Z dishes. Like this is a recipe testing day. And, as we were cooking together, and I was asking questions, all of a sudden all these stories would come up that I had never heard because I just didn't, ask. And so it was really beautiful in that way, and that all of these stories that wouldn't have been told otherwise if I didn't show curiosity through this book. And one of the loveliest stories in the book was the soup lapsha, which is a chicken noodle soup. And my mom started to tell me, like for us, it was like as soon as, someone had like a little sniffle or sneeze, like the chicken she would put a chicken on the stove to get it boiling for bouillon and for soup. And it was homey dish. And my mom told me the story how when she was growing up, her mom would have to make the lapsha, the noodles, from scratch. And she had this like beautiful brown wooden table that my grandfather, her husband, built for her just for this task. And he carved her this long wooden rolling pin to roll out the lapsha. And it was one of her like most favorite comfort foods was this homemade chicken soup with homemade noodles. And my grandmother, my babushka, was had raised 11 children in Soviet Georgia, and that she had a really hard life. And towards the end, she struggled with heart failure, and she had a handful of heart attacks, and that essentially hospitalized her. And my mom was her main caregiver. And there was one day a few months into her hospital stay that, you know, she wasn't feeling well, and she asked my mom to bring her some soup, some chicken noodle soup, because that's what she was craving. She wanted something nourishing and comforting. And so my mom went home, made the noodles, bouillon. She brought it, and my grandmother was so grateful for her. And it was like you could tell that it sort of really kind of, you know, it was like soul food for her. And later that evening, she suffered another heart attack and passed away. And so that was her last meal. And my mom, you know, was telling me this story, and we were both crying by the end. And that was, you know, it's a dish that I grew up eating hundreds of times. And it wasn't until I showed curiosity and asked that the story came up. And even for her, you know, it was like she probably doesn't think about this every time she makes it, but it just sort of started to kind of sketch her memory. And so that happened so many times throughout the book. Or like she would tell me stories of like how her father would knead the dough for kulich, the Easter bread, and you know they didn't have stand mixers or anything, and he was making it for, you know, 12, 14 people. And so he'd have like this big metal tub, and he'd be like in this like little white tank, and would be like, you know, using his whole body to knead this big batch of dough. And she was like, by the end he was just like completely drenched in sweat. And so it was like a way, and I think that really kind of speaks to how food, you know, food is not just, I mean, it's sustenance, and it's food to nourish your bodies, but it's also a way that really kind of connects us to family stories and memories, and to the family that we left behind. And I always think back to there's this book that I read a few years ago by, and I don't remember where he's from, but his name is a chef, Edward Lee, and he wrote this book called Buttermilk Graffiti, and he's sort of trying to explore what American food is, but through different immigrant stories. And he has this one passage where he's sitting down with a Moroccan family, and they have a young son who was born here, grew up here. And he asks them, you know, what is lost with each generation of migration? And they said, you know, the first thing lost is language. And then it's, you know, traditions. And then it's memories of old relatives or family friends. And like, what do we have left? But food, and food is sort of this through line that connects us to, you know, what we've left behind. And when I read that, that was really, for me, like it just sort of clicked, because I was like, this is exactly why I've always been drawn to my family's food, and why I've always felt this calling to preserve and document it, because like my Russian is like, I don't know, 6th grade level. Like I mean, I would not be able to give this speech in Russian. But food for me, like I can make hinkali better than anyone in my family at this point, because I've practiced so much, and I've done so much research, and I've approached it with so much like you know, thought and attention, and you know, this sort of like intentional approach in a way that they've never had to or even thought to. And that's been it's been really meaningful to be able to, you know, I might not be able to have a philosophical debate in Russian, but I can talk for an hour to people about this food. So
Do you think working on this book brought you and your mom closer together?
Yeah, absolutely. And my aunts, it was also really wonderful. You know, and it's like in our family, it's like each woman has their own specialties, you know, or like for holiday gatherings, it's like, okay, my mom always brings the khali and her ideal tort, which is like a type of honey cake, and my aunt Natasha will always bring alibia salat and the medavik, and you know, everyone sort of is charge of the same dishes every year, and so a lot of the recipes were from my mom, but also from my aunts. And so it was a chance for me to call up my aunts, and I couldn't just be like, hi, I haven't talked to you in 3 months, give me this recipe. It's like, okay, Titi Olia, how are you? Tell, рассказывай. And so it was a chance for me to kind of reconnect with them too. So, and it's really, for us, for my family, it's like such a treasure to be able to have this beautiful book that has commemorated my family's stories. And I dedicated the book to my mom and my aunts, and so there's a picture of them in the front. There's a couple of pages of my family. I got them all together for a cookout in the summertime, and I had my best friend take pictures. And so there's a couple pages of my family at the table, and there's like shashlik and pirashki and khachapuri and all of akroshka. And so it's a really sort of, family treasure. And I always joke, if no one reads my book or buys it, at least I have it for myself and for my children and our family. So
That's absolutely worth
yeah.
it. Yeah. So you have these chapters dedicated to like each like class of meals.
Yeah.
So let's do your most favorite, starting with breakfast.
Ooh, I cook from that all the time. I love the sirniki. They're so it's like they have this nice like outside crust or korочка, and inside it just like it melts in your mouth, and they're not too sweet, and just like with some sour cream and some fresh preserves, they're so good. Although I always tell people it's really important you get the like very dry crumbly tvorog, because if you get the one that's more kind of like creamy, they'll just fall apart. So you need dry crumbled tvorog. I also really like the oladushki with apple. Yeah.
Sorry, I just speaking of the ingredients, how do you find the right ingredients for dishes? Because some of the great cooks who are present here cannot find good flour that they used to have for their recipes for a long time.
Yeah.
So being an immigrant to the States, we have to kind of like adjust and adapt and find the ingredients here that might work.
Yeah.
For the recipes, what is your advice?
I mean, for a lot of like flour, sugar, my family just went to I don't know what the local grocery store is. Do you have QFC? I don't know. Whatever yours, they would just get at the Stop and Shop. So that was nothing special. I mean, we had, I grew up in Rhode Island, this tiniest state, and so we had one Eastern European store for the entire state, and so that's where we'd get our like kefir and our tvorog and all of our spices. I think for like Georgian spices for a long time, if someone was traveling to Georgia, we'd put in an order as a cost of like, okay, get me this these spices, this. But now, I mean, online you can get anything, and I actually have been working a lot with a Georgian spice company called Suneli Valley, and they work with local farmers in Georgia, and they import Georgia like very, very high quality, very fresh Georgian spices. And I have a little coupon flyer code for everyone here. They're not paying me, I promise. I really I became friends with them, and when I was in Georgia a year and a half ago, I met up with them, and they took me to the countryside where they grow everything, and they show me their facilities, and so they're the real deal. But really, I mean, I'm even seeing like farmer's cheese, tvorog, more and more just like my regular grocery store. But aside from that, I mean, it's a lot of sorrel, shabil, that's always been hard. It's like unless you grow it, yes, it's like you have to, and as it's like a weed. Once you plant it, it'll take over your garden. So yeah, my aunt Olga, she had a big sorrel, so we'd always get sorrel from her. So a lot of it was sort of a little bit having to be resourceful, or if you don't have sorrel, you just use spinach and add a lot of lemon juice at the end. So it sort of had
That's
to
a great too.
adapt, or where we grew up in Rhode Island, there's a big Portuguese community, and they cook with this hot crushed pepper relish. That's actually very not in spice, but is very similar to adjika. So whenever we couldn't get adjika, we would just use this hot crushed garlic. Or I tell people in the book you can use like chili garlic sauce, or sort of Asian chili garlic sauce. So there's
There are ways.
there are ways, and also a lot of the recipes, you don't have to have special ingredients. It's a lot of it's just like seasonal produce. It's very vegetable forward too. So
Yeah, going back to the book,
Yeah.
let's do a couple more of your favorite recipes
Okay.
from here, like personal picks.
Okay, so I said sirniki, оладушки. Trying to think what else. It's so funny when people ask me questions about specific recipe, because all of a sudden I can't remember any recipe that's in the book.
We can narrow the circle. What about soups?
Soups. I mean, my family's borscht is excellent. Again, I think because it has a little bit of a Georgian accent, so I think it's a little bit different for people and it's very thick, and just like there's just so much cabbage and peppers and onions, and it's I think Americans are often their borscht for them is like cold and maybe pureed. It's it's very different. Let's see what else. So there's the soups. I mean, the mushroom buckwheat chicken soup is very homey, and again we add a little adjika to it just to kind of give it, and lots of herbs to give it flavor. Meats and seafood.
Yeah, there's a beautiful grains.
Yes, the cagliette are really
section.
delicious. It's such a comfort food.
Yeah.
We add my mom adds zucchini, grated zucchini, to make it a little bit lighter instead of milk and bread. Beef stroganoff is really delicious. Great for Valentine's Day. It's like you get a nice steak and have a nice glass of red wine. It'd be a nice Valentine's Day dinner. The khachapuri, we have a couple of different khachapuri. We have the and we have one that I always grew up growing up with is this like penovani khachapuri, where you use store-bought puff pastry and you cook it in a baking sheet, and it's so easy. It comes together in like 20 minutes. It's roll out dough, put cheese, another layer of dough, and you bake it. And it's like really great for a party. Everyone loves melty cheese and puff pastry. And we have the round kind of imeruli khachapuri too in the book. That's delicious. The plov in that grains chapter, I really there's one from Uzbekistan and one from Azerbaijan, and I love the one from Azerbaijan because it has all sorts of dried fruit and chestnuts and walnuts, and it was again, I was a picky eater, but I'd always eat rice with dried fruit. Is such a comfort food. So yeah, and the sweets chapter, it's like one delicious dessert after another. The ideal torta I highly recommend. Medavika is like a whole afternoon or a couple day project, but ideal is just 2 layers of honey cake, and the frosting is dulce de leche and butter, and you top it with chocolate and walnuts, and it's so simple and it's so good.
So that was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I
now-
can keep talking.
Yeah, guys, if you have any
Yeah.
questions for Polina, please don't be shy. Sasha.
I wanted, so I saw that you went to Georgia, and I wasn't sure if that's your first time or not, but I just wanted to ask about your kind of going back to the homeland experience for
Yeah.
any of the post-Soviet
Yeah.
countries when you did that, and
Yeah.
just like what that was like, and if that opened up anything for you.
Yeah, that was interesting. So I've been 3 times, and the first time I went was in 2015, and it was with my mom. And it was the first time. I mean, really, it was the first time for me. It was 3 months when we immigrated, but it was the first time for her since she had been back to Georgia, and it was very bittersweet. You know, it was very for her. It was really sad to see. You know, I think for many immigrants, your understanding of a place or a country becomes frozen in time when you leave. And I think, you know, obviously she left in 92 as a very time full of turmoil, but before that, you know, she described Tbilisi as this you know, it was a city, but there was so much green, and there's like, and it was so beautiful, so clean, and it was just, if anyone's been to Georgia, it's a little, I mean, to Tbilisi, it's a little bit grimy. So like it's not, it's, you know, and a lot, especially in the 90s, you know, like everything was like the trolleys were, you know, they literally like they disbanded the trolleys and like ripped all the metal parts and like sold it off to Turkey, and a lot of the buildings were just like totally looted, and so it was just it was very different from her, and she like missed the Georgia Tbilisi that she left behind. And for me, you know, having no understanding, like this is what it was. It wasn't bittersweet. It was really for me special to be able to come back to or go to a country that I've only know through stories, and through the lens of my mom and her and my aunts and uncles. And I felt like I felt immediately at home, you know, and even though I'm not Georgian, but I felt like I came back to like the homeland. And every time I've gone back, it's been really special. And it's interesting because I think, you know, for our family, you know, if we want to eat Georgian food, like we can't just go to a restaurant around the corner to eat it. We have to make it at home. And I think basically only having to work off of like memory and taste memory, and they've had to make these recipes and kind of trial and error make them sort of like the best version that they remember them. And oftentimes when on the trips, there have been so many times where we've had, you know, adjika or khachapuri, or, you know, these different traditional dishes. And even like my husband will look over me and say, you know what, your family does it better. And that was just sort of sort of remarkable that like here we are, we're not even, you know, ethnically Georgians, and we're living in Rhode Island, but like we're like making some like the best Georgian food because we've had to adapt, and that was what we've had to do. So and of course it's interesting to like interact with different generations, because, you know, younger generations don't want anything to do, you know, with Russia, and only want to speak English, and it was always easier to get around in the countryside where the older generation is Russian speaking. And I actually got a lot of practice, Russian speaking practice on my trips to Georgia, which was not always, I wasn't expecting that. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
I'm curious if like Armenian cuisine is also in the mix in your book.
There's a couple of Armenian recipes. Unfortunately, my father can't boil a pot of pasta to save his life, and he wouldn't dispute that. Yeah, so because all of my cooking comes through my mom and my aunts and not my father, unfortunately, I don't have as many Armenian recipes as I would like, but I do have a couple, the gata, in the sweets chapter, it's this sort of buttery pastry that kind of looks like a cross between rugula and strudel. And I've since learned that it's a very specific gata from Yerevan. And depending on where you go in Armenia, it's like different versions, just like khachapuri. If you go to Georgia, there's, not just one, there's many. So I have the gata, and that's sort of become my specialty in my family. Like I always get an order to make that for family gatherings. The like marinated red peppers with celery stalk and celery leaves and lots of garlic. That's like a very sort of Armenian appetizer. And so there's that. And then we have like a hot yogurt soup, which my family calls like matsone with soup. But it's a hot yogurt soup with rice and different herbs, and they make it in Georgia, but they also make it in Armenia too. So I wish I had more Armenian recipes, but maybe next book. Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah, maybe.
Right, we still have room for a couple more questions. Yep.
And I guess my other question is, are there any aspects of like sort of American fusion or do you go into like? I mean, I guess this relates to ingredients, but
Yeah.
maybe more than that. I mean, the spice aspect to it does seem to.
There is one recipe, the garlicky beer shrimp. It's not Eastern European, it's not Georgian. I think it's just something that my mom, I don't know, started cooking during, here in the States. And, it has like some kind of inflection as like garlic and parsley and paprika. And I had this chapter, meats and seafood, and we're like, okay, we actually started out with only one seafood recipe, and we're like, okay, we can't really call it a meats and seafood chapter if there's only one seafood recipe. So I added the garlicky beer shrimp. So I guess that's a little bit of American influence. And then the other recipe is smoked mackerel, it's like scumbria with potatoes. So, and it's not really so much a recipe of just like how you prepare it. We've cooked a lot of like the more American dishes I didn't include in the book because they don't, but my aunt likes to make pasta Alfredo with broccoli and chicken or chicken teriyaki or something, but yeah.
Thank you. Well,
Sorry, I have one more question. I like that me and Olga. I remember you wrote an essay at some point, and this is something that I also learned about a while ago in Russia, and you wrote about Ukraine, and now I'm just thinking about it as you were talking about like the rebirth or the going back to the pre-Soviet recipes, which has been a thing in kind of in the post-Soviet world. So I just wanted to, I don't know.
The Bloomberg essay, about
or
the
just generally what you've seen or think about that.
Yeah, so Sasha's referring to an essay I wrote about how in the 1930s, Stalin's food commissar, what's his name? Anatoly Myokin? Yes, sorry. He came out with a cookbook called The Book of Tasty, Healthy Food. And it was sort of this book that it was like it was very like grounded in Slavic Eastern European dishes, but it was also cuisines from all over the USSR. And, and it came out a few years after the Holodomor, the famines were happening, and Stalin had this, great speech of like, we're doing well, we're very wealthy, like we've reached this new level of I don't know, richness, and progress. And of course, you know, it's like people are dying left and right from famine, but they came out with this cookbook and it became this runaway hit where, you know, over the span of the Soviet Union, it had over 20 editions, and each edition would be sold out in the millions, like sold millions and millions of copies. And it was obviously very much like a propaganda tool. It was like a way for them to say, like, look how rich we are. We, you know, all these different foods we have access to. Look at our canning industry, how technologically advanced it is. And so it was trying to like paint this idealistic utopia, or culinary utopia on one hand. On the other, it was sort of like, and also we are like, look at all of this food that belongs to all of us. We are like this brotherhood of people. And of course, you know, the average person could not even get half of the ingredients for a recipe, let alone, you know, make it. But you know, the way that I write about it is, you know, it's like this cookbook that is sort of used as this propaganda tool, and these dishes that all of a sudden became, you know, under the Soviet canon, and it belongs to all of us. And, you know, on the many levels it was untrue, but on some hand, like, you know, the Soviet machine was successful in kind of getting this idea across of like, we are all sort of one people, and they did it through food. And, you know, obviously, like, stepping into the Eastern European store is one example, because it's like all of these dishes sort of belong to all of us, or at least we're all familiar with all of them. And, you know, when we immigrated to the States, it was sort of like history repeating itself. You know, we had the church and our potluck, and we were like really kind of living out the Soviet dream of eating all of each other's foods. And also we had access to all these ingredients to actually make the dishes. And meanwhile, people who were left behind in the 90s were really kind of fighting for their lives, or, you know, they're trying to survive. They weren't thinking like, you know, a potluck. They were thinking like, how am I going to get food for our next meal? And, you know, 2000s, you know, things sort of started to stabilize, and it sort of went in hand with these countries that were trying to establish their sovereignty and kind of rebuild their nation state. And so you see all of a sudden this, I call it gastro-nationalism, this like resurgence of like, you know, borscht is a Ukrainian dish, and you know, Georgians trying to you know, really kind of market their wine, or all of a sudden these food battles of like, who makes the best plov, you know, Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, or like, who does dolma belong to, Azerbaijan or Armenia, and same goes for lavash. And so it's all of a sudden you see these like politics kind of playing out in the culinary world. And I remember reading Anya von Bremzen. She's written a lot of cooking cookbooks, and you know, I read an interview where she says, you know, oftentimes these debates over where a certain dish comes from, where, and who does it belong to, is more a reflection of current politics than the actual food or question itself. And it's still, I think, like a question mark, because, you know, let's take borscht, for example. Like, I think we can all agree that it comes from Ukraine, but there, you know, I think every immigrant family from Moscow to Tashkent makes borscht, you know, and there's as many recipes as there are cooks. And so like, at what point does a food or a dish travel and become someone else's, right? And so I think it's like an ongoing conversation and debate. And I think obviously this was sort of what was in the back of my mind while I was writing this book, of like, who do these dishes belong to? Because, you know, I could write a whole history of like, borscht belongs to Ukraine, and this is how, and dolma, you know, is Armenia or Azerbaijan. And for me, it was sort of like, I can't give definitive answers because that's not my job, and that's not what I'm trying to do in the book. I'm grounding it in my lived experience, and I can only speak to what I know. And again, that's sort of this idea of like post-Soviet comes into play, because I feel like it's sort of this useful term to describe this whole again, convergence, confluence. And at the same time, I also give credit where credit's due, and really celebrate the diversity rather than just lumping it under one culture, one people. So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that was like a really fun essay. And I like ended up ordering a 1959 edition from Ukraine that I got. And then I was in my mom's basement a couple of weeks ago, and she had the book. And I was like, Mom, I asked you about it. And she's like, oh, this book. Like, I don't know. I haven't opened it in decades. I didn't know that was the book you were talking about. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Right. Well, yeah, I know there's one more upcoming event here in San Francisco.
Oh, yes.
And it's going to be very special.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing it up. So tomorrow, if any of you are familiar with the Scandinavian Cafe Canteen, I don't know what part of the city it is.
Market Street.
Yeah, Market Street. They are running a special lunch menu that features a couple of dishes from the book. They're making the blinchiki s tvorogam, the crepes filled with farmer cheese, and they're having some sort of fresh, compote or preserve. They're making buzhenina, which is like a roasted pork with the vitamin salad. It's a cabbage, beet, apple salad with, they're making khachapuri, but they're making it with gooseberries. My family, speaking of like a example of trying to adapt, we started making khachapuri with cranberries because you couldn't always get sour plums, but cranberries are another sour fruit. So we make it with gooseberries, and then they're also baking the nidavi because it's Valentine's Day, and honey cake for your honey. And they're doing that all weekend long. So, and I'll be there signing books and hanging out. So yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Polina.
Yeah.
We're gonna move to the tea drinking part.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I talked so much.
That's why you're here.
So do you have, if people want to sign a copy, do you have a marker?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
This is your water bottle.
Oh, thank you. Do you want me to just sit?
Yeah, sure. Let me help you with that.
Hello.
I'm ready to but my Russian and
Легче можно. Я все понимаю, просто язык немножко поломенный. Даша.
For any copy you want. They're all $38.50.
Celebration. I forgot what was.
You like this?
Since it's a credit card,
That's not a problem.
Oh, at the festival.
Где-то в августе.
Мороженое с чесноком.
We can buy the book with you.
Yeah.
Я была
Ну да. And знаете ресторан Хачка? Это как советская, все наши блюда. And we did a toast. They make their own vodka infusions, and they made it with garlic for the dinner. They made it with garlic. It was actually yeah. Я понимаю, просто я стесняюсь начинать нервничать.